Scripture with you this morning. You can follow along in your Bible, and it will also be on the screens. We're going to be reading in Psalm 92, verses 1 through 4. It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your steadfast love in the morning and your faithfulness by night, to the music of the lute and the harp, to the melody of the lyre. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hands, I sing for joy.
All right, Shayla, thank you. Appreciate that. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Glad that you're here. My name's Dusty. I'm one of the pastors, and I'm really excited to jump into this. I've actually been waiting to preach this sermon for almost exactly 4 weeks. It was inspired from a couple times a year. I get together with some pastors that we went through a program together, and we've just committed to keep meeting and kind of from more like east, so we have to kind of meet in random places. But we had a conversation about this psalm, Psalm 92, and I've been thinking about it more than any other passage of scripture that I've read over the past several weeks, and thought, you know what, this would be a perfect sermon and conversation to have to start the new year. And so it's a really interesting psalm because it was probably, most people think, written by David, probably. And it was used for, like, if people think that it was used for, like, the Sabbath. And because of the nature of even these first few verses that Shayla read, that I think you can even see that intended to be used not just on the Sabbath day, but even in the context of worship, that it would make sense the way it almost has a liturgical feel of something that you would read at a worship service, just like what we're doing, which Jewish communities would have done on the Sabbath. And so it's interesting there, but it begins to build, and a lot of the conversation I want to have really crescendos at the end of this psalm, which is not unusual for how the psalms tend to work. It's like any other song; it oftentimes builds up to the end of the song, and that's how this one is. And what David is doing, presumably, he's lived enough life to be reflecting on possible outcomes, on how people can live and how people can choose to do things. And likely, at least middle age, if not older David, kind of reflecting back and thinking ahead and really asking this question as he's considering possible outcomes based on what you do with God. Do you reject him and his teachings? Do you stay close to God, or do you stay a long ways away from him and do your own thing? And like trajectories that takes you on. And it's really asking this kind of question. And I think it's a different kind of question than we tend to ask this time of the year. I think that the questions we tend to ask are more outcome oriented of like, what do we want this year? Is, a coach is like, I want to win state. I know that's going to be the goal every year, and, business owners in here are like, hey, we want to make budget. We want this level of profitability. We want to roll out this new product, or we want to tighten up this aspect, whatever it is. All right, you got mostly outcome oriented, or even on a personal level, you're like, I want to read a book a week. I want a cold plunge. I want to whatever. Maybe starting next week when it's not so cold, which may defeat the purpose. I'm not sure, but it's more outcome. I want to lose 10 pounds, and they're kind of outcome oriented, and it's different that David here, as he begins to reflect on things, that it's not going to be so much on output, but more like what kind of person do you want to be? That's something that we often don't think about. We may think about these other things that are more output oriented. What kind of person do I want to be in the future? And not so much different circumstances, but me, like what kind of person? And that's an interesting question. And I think it's a really good New Year's conversation based on these trajectories of how life tends to go. So let me pick back up in verse 1. I'm going to read these first 5 verses that were read just a moment ago by Shayla. And again, just think you're gathered together as a church. Shouldn't be too hard for you to imagine. This would be very similar to what Israel would have been doing, gathering together with a covenant community. And these first 5 verses would have felt very in place in a setting like this. It's a psalm of praise is how it starts. It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your steadfast love. That word is really important, those 2 words, steadfast love. It's one Hebrew word. We'll come back to that. Your steadfast love in the morning, your faithfulness by night. Faithfulness would really be a synonym there for steadfast love. To the music of the lute and of the harp and the melody of the lyre. Those are all musical instruments they would have used. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hand, I sing for joy. How great are your works, O Lord. Your thoughts are very deep. So again, this is a psalm of praise. It's all vertically oriented towards the Lord. Here's who you are. We want to praise your attributes, the nature of what it means to be God. And the centerpiece for this is that word that I highlighted, steadfast love. This is the Hebrew word chesed, which is really meaning like steadfast love is one way. I love that translation of it. Another way I've heard it described before is God's covenantal faithfulness. And so it would be anchored in God's covenant to Israel, that where God pledged himself to Abraham and his descendants. And Abraham and his descendants have not always been faithful. In fact, if you read through the Old Testament on the whole, you'd be like, not so much. So they weren't always faithful, but who was always faithful was God. He was always faithful to his promise, always. And he kept coming back to that. And faithfulness would be, again, a synonym for that it's anchored in God's covenant where he's pledged himself to his people. So this psalm begins off saying, hey, we're going to sing praises. And the specific thing that we're declaring that's so great about God is he's faithful. He's faithful, that he does what he says he'll do. Now, for Christians, we would look at this. Anytime you read the Old Testament, we want to read from where we are now, and we want to read through the cross and resurrection of Jesus back to that setting. So now we would understand that God's covenantal faithfulness to us is pledged through the cross, through Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, that he's committed himself to us. And because of that, like God is committed. And so it's not ultimately dependent on your performance, even though we very much do want to honor God and obey God with how we live. That the thing that we praise is not so much our devotion, even though we do seek to be devoted to him. The thing we praise actually is God's devotion to us. It's actually what motivates any response that we have of devotion is reflexive. It's initiated by him, and it's like we're like a mirror echoing off his devotion to us that returns in devotion to him. So declaring his steadfast love, his faithfulness, like all day long, morning and night. And then to instruments, they're talking lute and harp and lyre, we're talking bass guitar, drum set, whatever, all that. And for you, O Lord, have made me glad. So even this is important here. There's a happiness of soul in response to this. There's my heart is happy as I reflect on this. Whenever I stop and reflect on your nature and who you are for me, it actually moves me, like emotionally. It moves me to a point of joy. There's a gladness of soul, and I love that's really, if you think about what worship is, worship is not just like we're singing along and a little bouncing ball that goes over each words and we sing along and that's just what we do. But the whole point of it is there's even a sense of joy as we're singing about who God is and nothing but the blood, that there's nothing else. I have no other hope. Nothing else can make me whole other than what Christ has done. And that actually brings me joy to know that this is the kind of commitment that God has towards me, all the way to sending his only son. Like that's what we just did, that even brings a gladness of soul. And I'm glad by your work, and of the works of your hand, I sing for joy. That's another emotionally expressive word right there. There's joy, there's gladness. And again, that last explosive sentence there, how great are your works, O Lord. And even a sense of God's wisdom, of your thoughts are very deep. And that's an interesting expression of praise towards God too, of that, man, sometimes I get mad at God and I begin to accuse him of why didn't you do it this way? I mean, hasn't this happened in your life where you get a little bit of time and you get some years or even decades after the fact and you get a little bit of perspective and you're like, oh, okay, like that was terrible. I wouldn't want to go through that again. But you were doing things in me and you were doing things in other people that were hard for me to see in that moment. And I wouldn't want to relive them. That event was very bad or sad, but you were redemptively doing something in me that I don't know could have been done any other way. You were very deep. Like I'm reading one sentence of one paragraph of one chapter of one book, and you've read the whole book. In fact, you've read all of the books. Your thoughts are very deep. So again, this is an expression of praise of everything, and I know like this. Your thoughts are really deep. There's a depth to God that we tend to underestimate. So again, that's the start off of this whole psalm. Is one that's vertically oriented. It's one that could have been. There's tons of psalms like this. It would have been great to have read as a call to worship today at Redeemer. It'd be great to have been read as a call to worship in a synagogue in ancient Israel as well. So now we pick up, and this is where you begin to see some of the reflection on this question I asked earlier on, okay, so this first 5 verses is a psalm of praise, but then it pivots now, and David's reflecting on, does someone engage God at that level or not? Does their heart end up being glad in who God is, in his covenantal faithfulness, or do we reject that? Do we ignore that? Do we do our own thing? And what are the consequences on what you do with that? Like this is where he's reflecting. All right, so now verse 6. This is not my language here. This is the Bible. The stupid man cannot know, all right? So it's possible the Bible just called you stupid. I don't know. The fool cannot understand this. You might have just been called a fool. I don't know. You'll have to determine that for yourself. That though the wicked sprout like grass and all evildoers flourish, they are doomed to destruction forever. All right, so that's one trajectory of what kind of person that you could be in the future. But you, O Lord, are on high forever. So that's in contrast, right? But behold your enemies, O Lord, for behold your enemies shall perish. All evildoers shall be scattered. But you have exalted my horn like that of a wild ox. You have poured over me fresh oil. My eyes have seen the downfall of my enemies. My ears have heard the doom of my evil assailants. Okay, so in these few verses, he's reflecting on what happens if someone doesn't do verses 1 through 5. And really the answer for this is that a foolish person rejects who God is, rejects his authority, and rejects his wisdom. Remember all that deep thought thing that they're like, no, you don't know what you're doing, God, and I'm not even sure if you're there at all. And there's even a sense of like even the greatness of his works. The fool would reject the greatness of God's works, deny his commitment to us, and deny his love, deny all those things that would reject being glad in him. You might even go to religious services, but there's an arm's length, if not an outright rejection. And now he just immediately cuts to the chase. There are some other Psalms. If I were going to give recommended reading, maybe even required reading from this psalm, from this sermon today, I would love for you to go back and read Psalm 73. It's one of my favorite Psalms because it starts off with like one verse of like, hey, and God does good things to those who trust him. But like the rest of it's a complaint about like, but wait, hold up. I see all sorts of people that reject who God is that seem like they're getting ahead. And I know all sorts of godly people that are really suffering. So what gives? And it's the whole psalm. And it gives a lot more texture than this psalm does. This one cuts to the chase. I mean, it's like the majority of the psalm is a complaint. And there's this, and there's this, and they don't have trouble like me, and all this, right? You may have felt that way before when you're kind of having a pity party and kind of accusing God of things, or maybe that's just me. And then at the very end, it comes around in a way that this psalm does. At the very end of Psalm 73, and it reminds me of this, it's like, it does seem like they get ahead, and this psalm is acknowledging that because it says the wicked sprout like grass. I mean, they grow real quick and they grow real green, and I mean they're like Bermuda in the summer, and that's hard for us to think about on a day like today where our grass is yellow. It's maybe my least favorite Lubbock time of the year. I've complained about that a little bit today already, but think middle of the summer, and in the middle of heat, Bermuda goes nuts. It's got those runners that go off in every direction. Give it a little bit of water, give some heat, it goes crazy. And that's what he's saying, like the evil people are those that reject who God is, and there's a flourishing, they sprout, and even acknowledges that they flourish. And so what can happen here is appearances can be deceiving, that you can have someone that's rejected God's ways and it can seem like they're doing awesome, living their best life. And it can look different based on different life stages. You can have, like when you're younger, that can look like the party guy or girl that is almost this enviable lifestyle. They're having an incredible time. They may even be trying to talk you into coming to join them. This is so good. You don't want to miss Friday night. It's amazing. This is so much fun. You're not going to believe who's going to be there, and you're not going to believe what we're going to drink or whatever, all right, all the things. And you're like, man, they're living their best life. This is incredible. Now, the small print is, it looks like it's all incredible, and they're even running with a cool crowd and everything else. But then over time, perhaps some mistakes are made in those settings that go their whole life with them. Or maybe even some long-term addictions, or just a deep emptiness of soul. I mean, I realize some of you are new today, but if you've been around Redeemer, how many stories, baptism stories, did you hear last year? They were like, yeah, I did it all, man. I did the party scene. I did relationships. I did this. I did this. I did this. And then I was really trying to find happiness. And what I found was I reached the end of myself. I mean, how many times have we heard that story that it seems like that grass is really spreading out, but it doesn't have any root and it doesn't last. And the psalmist here considers where does all this take you? Where does this kind of lifestyle take you? And it takes towards destruction. Like, it doesn't take you to a good place. Or if you move to a different life stage, you think about the super successful business guy that honestly you've been comparing yourself to, and you kind of gauge your success against this guy. And it seems like not only their business, but even side hustles and investments seem like that they're going crazy and blowing up at every turn. And they've been more successful than you, and you're in the same industry as them. And you've been comparing yourself to them. And it seems, and you know that they don't love God. In fact, that you've had some run-ins with them that haven't been real pleasant, and yet it seems like that they're succeeding in everything they do. But again, where the psalmist would say is just think about where all this goes. Think about the trajectory of this, and it could be later you find out that they're cutting corners legally and even getting into trouble, and maybe not doing things in an ethical and honest way. People having bad experiences working with them or for them, or it could even be that they're not cutting corners, like they're ethical in terms of the legality, but their whole career has just get stacks and stacks of coins and dollars in the middle of their table, and they've exploited employees and customers and anybody else they can, that all that mattered was getting ahead and winning, and it was all for them, not for anyone else. Or you could do this with a million different things, where the Instagram follow that looks like they're living the picture perfect life in every way, with incredible vacations and clothes and homes and all the things, and incredible pictures of their family. It looks like it's amazing, but the marriage is a train wreck, and they've never wanted to submit their lives to God, their marriage to God. It all looks amazing on Instagram. It looks like it's grass that's flourishing, but again, there's no root, and so on and so forth. And an interesting question here to ask that I think David is inviting us into on this, who do you want to be, is you consider the negative trajectory, is like what little decisions are made in the Instagram perfect person's posts back when they're 22 and 30. And what about that business guy? What decisions are being made about how you're going to do business, how you're going to interact, how you're going to relate with God? Little small commitments, small decisions that are made all along the way that take you to a certain place. So again, this is where we all have our things. This is our question we're asking today, is what kind of person we want to be. And I've seen, it's not just that there's only two kinds of people here. Sometimes I find myself in the foolish, stupid person role, and I get salty and surly towards the Lord. I can keep him at arm's length. I can withdraw. I can begin to accuse him, and just even one point after another begin to withdraw from being close to him, which we're going to hear about in a second. And it may all look good on the outside, but my soul is beginning to decay inside. And any Christian that here knows this feeling, that you may be acting foolishly in a season because you're rejecting who God is and really drawing near to him in a sense of trust and faith in him. All right, so that would be one trajectory that is available to us, is the way of the fool, the stupid person who rejects who God is. And all of us have some of this in us. All right, so if you're like, are you calling me foolish? I mean, probably. All right, so I'm just with you in it if it makes you feel any better. All right, so now let's talk about another thing that's available while we're asking what kind of person that we want to be. And these are the few verses here that really were the center point of our conversation with my pastor friends. Here we go. Verse 12. The righteous, so this is on the other hand, these are people that do trust who God is and do celebrate who God is and his nature, like those first 5 verses. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like the cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. So cool. All right, so again, this is David, and he has to have lived at least enough life to have seen how things tend to go, these two trajectories of wisdom and worship versus folly and rejection. All right, so he's lived enough life to see where these things take you, and destruction is over here and life is over here. All right, he's seen enough of that. So at least mid-age, if not older David. Has to be, right? I don't know that a 19-year-old is doing a lot of reflection on, well, let me tell you, like while they spit the grounds out of the coffee that they're drinking, let me tell you a few things I've learned over the years. I don't know that there's enough life experience to make these declarations here, but someone that's lived a little bit of life can reflect and say, I've seen this and I've seen this. These are my observations. I've seen these kinds of things. So it's really interesting, even the metaphors that are used here. And off the top, these may not seem that significant to us, like the flourishing. And by the way, even these words, flourish, grow, planted, flourish, bear fruit, full of sap and green. These are all the words that are used in these few verses here. But it's interesting, the imagery here around the palm tree and the cedar tree. So I did a little research on both. Palm trees, super interesting. Although I've seen a couple of people here that have them. Usually if you see a palm tree in someone's yard, a backyard, if they've got a pool, it's usually fake, all that, because it kind of has an ambiance. But they don't really do well in a spot that doesn't have much moisture in the air and that it does this in January for the most part. So they need the right climate and they need regular pruning. But an interesting thing about palm trees is they're incredibly resilient. Like if you look at post-hurricanes on coastal areas, you'll see like all kinds of destruction and like buildings that are down on the ground and all sorts of, stuff that's washed out because of the water and erosion and all that. But what you'll see standing? Palm trees. I mean, those things, they like bend, like they can bend like this. Like I've got a weird fascination with it. Sometimes whenever there's a hurricane coming in, they'll have like live cams. I remember watching one that hit the Texas coast a couple of years ago, and there was a palm tree like doing like this. But that thing was still standing after that thing was over. They're flexible. It's really interesting. Over 2,600 different species of them, and super interesting what these things are. So in essence, when it says we want to flourish like the palm trees, this is saying there is something resilient, super strong, alive, flexible, beautiful too. There's a beauty to palm trees. That these would be the statements saying that, hey, we want a righteous person. If you choose this path here, there's something resilient about you, and you're able to make it through a lot of things, and you bring a lot of beauty into a setting. We're going to flourish like this, and then grow like a cedar in Lebanon. So you probably haven't been to Lebanon, so don't worry about that part. But cedar trees, Texas people, these things you should know about. Like I'm actually headed to Cedar Country today, and I'm right after I leave the 11 o'clock service, I'm going to pop a allergy pill right before I go because I've got to get out in front of that. This time of the year, those things kill me. And in fact, the place we're going to stay at, our Redeemer Network, which is our organization that we partner with to plant churches, really mostly in this region, and we plant churches that plant churches. We have a board meeting today, and then all the lead pastors get there tomorrow. But the guy that owns this ranch is an elder at Redeemer Brady, and a guy named Phil Chavon. Love Phil, and he's tried to rehab a lot of their land that has been in his family for a long time. And one of the things they try to do is slowly clear out cedars, because they've outcompeted all the oak trees there, and they guzzle water, all right, like double the amount of water roughly that oak trees tend to drink. And if you want to like improve your water table and stuff like that, you begin to clear out the cedars and plant native oak trees there, and kind of the ecology tends to work out. So it seems like there's a real negative. Is like, wait, is David saying something bad about me that to be like a cedar? But there's a flip side of this. If you think about the flip side of everything I just told you about cedars, that they outcompete the oaks and they drink double the water, is that there's an obvious positive to this. Is there's a resilience there. Even the strength of the wood, they make incredible windbreaks because even tools, because of how solid the wood is. And Phil was explaining a lot of these things. They grow faster than most trees, 1 to 2 feet a year, and they're so strong. Again, very similar to that palm tree. They prevent soil erosion and all of that. So if you put these two trees together, when he's saying, hey, we want to be, if you look at the scripture, we want to flourish like the palm tree, we want to grow like the cedar in Lebanon, that you've got something that's resilient and strong and beautiful and fast growing and hardy. All right, and it's going to last. It's not going away anytime soon. So it's really interesting that if you move to the next verses and you see that these trees flourish when they're close to God. That's what's going to be interesting about verse 13. It says they are planted this palm and cedar and these beautiful, strong, hardy trees, they're planted in the house of the Lord and they flourish in the courts of our God. So this is language of the temple. And the temple represented the place in Israel where God and humans could be close to each other. Now, in the New Testament, again, we read all these things through the cross and resurrection. The New Testament has explained to us that through Jesus' death and resurrection, John 1 even describes Jesus as the temple incarnate, like the word of flesh became near and became like the temple became near to humanity. So in short, if you put all this together, being near to God, being close to God is how this flourishing happens. So pull all this together, you've got the foolish person that stays away from God, doesn't want to praise God, keeps God at a distance, may even go to church, but probably not, keeps God at a distance, does their own life, and it may look good for a little while, but it doesn't last. Destruction is their end. At least, spiritually speaking, there's a rejection of God, there's a destruction there, probably in terms of life consequences, no matter what the Instagram feed looks like. Conversely, there's a flourishing whenever we are near to God. There's a resilience and a strength and a flexibility and a growth that happens when we're close to God. So as I reflect on this, on times, I've told you a second ago, plenty of times when I haven't been near to God and haven't trusted God and I've kept him at arm's length. But when I have been close to God and I just trust and take a deep breath and abide in him and move towards prayer and praise, that those are times where I've got perspective, I have peace, I'm trusting God even when circumstances are boiling around me. It's just a totally different experience, even emotionally, of my realities around me. So verse 14 to me is the banger in this whole thing. And it's really what I want to leave you with because I love it so much. This verse is the thing that stood out. And it's this verse really of what it is, why it is that I even wanted to preach this sermon in a lot of ways. It says, they still, talking about these wise people that are like the cedar in Lebanon and like the palm tree, that it says they still bear fruit in old age. Again, this is David reflecting. He's seen enough of this. This is probably old David, and he's thinking about his life going forward. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. I love this. You've already given all the metaphors and all of this, but it's talking about the righteous person. If you are on that trajectory of praise and nearness to God and all of that being trained and changed by God, there's a fruit in old age, and you cut into the branch, and it's not dry and easily broken, but it's green and sappy. All right? So let's chat about this. I mean, finishing and aging. Let's just talk about this because it's super interesting to me that aging tends to not go very well for most of us. I mean, even in fact, most of the time we are working very hard to not age. I mean, there's all sorts of product you can buy. I'm not saying it's bad, but like to push back aging, whether it's skin or even fitness and all kinds of things. I mean, go at it. That's all fine. But like we're working very hard against some of those things there. But the reality is that aging tends to not do really great things. I mean, I saw a study recently that did a study of every biblical character. Exactly 1 out of 3 finished well. 1 out of 3. You know, those aren't great odds. They're like finished loving God and walking in his ways and leading well, living for other people and not for self. 1 out of 3, all right? There are an internet full of stories of pastors completely unraveling that are there waiting to be discovered, should you choose to Google it, all right? Everywhere, if you want to look at it. And even if you take a step away from like the unraveling meltdown kind of stories, do you find most 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds full of sap and green and growing and alive to God, or more full of cynicism and complaints? Right? This is the question that's being asked here. And aging tends to, apart from nearness to God, tends to build in some not great things. I was thinking through a few different options of these. So I came up with 5, just real quick off the top of my head, of different things, of different ways it can play out. Even as I'm reflecting, kind of like David, going, hey, how does this play out, good and bad? So alternatives to being full of sap and green is, Ain't anybody going to tell me nothing. You know, the little Nas X Red Raider basketball theme song of a few years ago, ain't anybody going to tell me nothing about nothing. And as we age, a lot of us, that's kind of where we tend to go, is that we resented the fact that our parents told us what to do, didn't like our professors and coaches and teachers telling us what to do, didn't like that first boss telling us what to do. I can't wait till I'm working for myself and ain't nobody going to tell me nothing ever about anything. Second thing is, hey, I've done my time. Look, I used to do those things. I hustled, I grinded at work, I served the church, I did this, I did that. I've done my time, I'm out. Now I'm just going to kind of do my deal. Third alternative is, I am when I am, and I'm not going to change. I've heard this loads of times from like older Christians, and it might be the most unchristian thing you can say, is when there is something that like you even admit is sinful, someone confronts you on it, or it's highlighted, or whatever the case is, and saying, I'm not going to change. Like the whole point of the gospel of grace is change, both to salvation, but also transformation and forgiveness and growth. Like that is what God intended to do, is his grace break in our life and continue to change green and sappy till the end. All right, number 4. Cynicism and criticism. That's another one. I think this naturally happens as you age, is you just tend to get over time, kind of arms crossed. What's really going on over there? You know, that kind of thing, all the time. Doesn't matter what, government, anything. I mean, it could be almost anything. Just getting more and more cynical, more and more critical. 5th, and finally, whatever your biggest issues are now will only be more so as you age. So I'll give you an example. If you're a loner, and in general, you just tend to keep people at arm's length, don't really have close friends, maybe you got like 0.5 close friends, something like that. If you're a bit of a loner at 40, you're going to be a hermit at 80, all right? So if you're a little bit salty at people and situations and cynical and all that at 50, you're going to be unbearable at 70, all right? That's how this deal works. What you are now, it just gets magnified as you age, and that's all of us, good or bad, okay? So those are alternatives. But I want to tell you something great, and this is where I want to end the sermon on, is this call to be green and sappy and be like that cedar tree and be like that palm tree as you age, this reflection on what kind of people we want to be. I look around to our young, let me just say a couple things to you, is I see this alive and at work in you. We have a place full of college students that want to be near God. Like prayer is exploding among our college students in a beautiful way that's actually challenging the rest of our church staff and church in a beautiful way. And I love that green and sappy at 21 and growing and being excited to be near God and pouring your life out and even seeing your career as something that would be subordinated to the glory of God. To the middle age, it's not too late. To many of us here, like everything just says, look, put my head down and just get this next stage done and take care of it. But I'll tell you this, among the middle-aged in this room, I see some of the most courageous faith in my entire life. Like I do esteem missionaries and church planters so much. It takes a lot of faith to do that, but it takes maybe even more faith to be middle-aged and doing all the craziness and yet live a life where you're green and sappy and serving others and serving God, glad to be in God's presence and making him known and using your time and your money and every aspect of your life to be lived for the glory of God. Like that might be the most radical faith that exists when everything is pressing down on you. And then finally, to the older folks that are here, my experience over 17 years, almost exactly right now, like 17 years is when Redeemer launched. 17 years ago, historically, when older folks like Empty Nest and above were connected to us here at Redeemer, that it's incredible because we had so few things to offer at that time. Now I think we have a really healthy community of senior adults that's like some of my favorite gospel communities in our church. But you know what drew and still draws a lot of folks that are older that don't have kids in the home anymore is they love who we're reaching. There's a really good chance maybe their kids and grandkids are at this church and they've grown to really appreciate even the emphasis of the gospel of grace and Jesus's grace to us in every way and even a culture of grace. But man, you want to talk about something that gets me fired up is when you see a green and sappy 75-year-old that is loving their grandchildren and a marriage that's growing and thriving, and they love to be close to the Lord. They love to pray. They love to put their preferences aside for the next generation. Awesome. So here's the thing, regardless of your age, regardless of your generation, go headlong into your issues, yes, but be close to the Lord. that's how we become the kind of person that I think you want to be, is being near to the Lord in prayer and hearing from him in his word. And I'm going to pray that that would be true. Lord, would you let us be the kind of people that would last and be like that cedar and palm tree? Lord, we want to be green and sappy.